Why did I change my budgie breeding setup? In this video, I share my personal experience and explain why I decided to change parts of my budgie. Why did I change my budgie breeding setup? For a long time, I thought my old setup was completely fine. The birds looked healthy, they were active, and from the outside, everything seemed normal. But slowly, I started noticing small problems. Some birds were becoming stressed. Some breeding pairs were not behaving the way I expected. And certain things in the aviary just didn't feel right anymore. At first, I ignored these problems, because sometimes, when you see birds every day, you don't immediately realize that something needs to change. But over time, I started understanding that the setup itself was affecting the birds more than I thought. In my experience, even small changes in space, breeding areas, or bird placement can make a very big difference. I also realized that just because a setup works okay, doesn't mean it's the best setup possible. And honestly, that's what made me rethink everything. So eventually, I decided to make some major changes to my budgie breeding setup. Some changes were simple, some took more time, but overall, the difference in the birds' behavior became very noticeable. The birds seemed calmer, the setup felt more organized, and breeding behavior started improving naturally. In this video, I'm going to explain exactly why I changed my setup, what problems I noticed, what mistakes I learned from, and what works much better for me now. So if you keep budgies, or you are planning your own breeding setup, this video may help you avoid some very common mistakes, and maybe even improve your own aviary setup too. Let's get started. Before I changed anything, my budgie breeding setup was very simple. At the time, I honestly believed it was working well enough. I had the breeding boxes set up. The birds had space to move around, and everything looked fine from the outside. But over time, I started paying more attention to the birds' behavior, and that's when I slowly realized that some parts of the setup were not as good as I first thought. For example, some breeding pairs looked comfortable, but others seemed stressed or unsettled. Sometimes, there was too much movement around certain breeding areas, and some birds didn't seem relaxed enough. I also noticed that a few birds were becoming territorial, especially around certain breeding boxes. At that point, I started understanding that I needed to rethink how the breeding setup was organized. Not because everything was terrible, but because I wanted a calmer, safer, and more effective setup for the birds. And honestly, that's what started the whole change. One of the biggest problems I started noticing was too much disturbance inside the breeding setup. At first, I didn't think it was a serious issue, because the birds were still eating, flying around, and behaving normally most of the time. But slowly, I realized that breeding birds are much more sensitive than I first thought. For example, even small things, like too much movement, checking the boxes too often, or birds constantly flying past each other, could affect their behavior. Some pairs looked nervous, especially when other birds came too close to their breeding area. And in my experience, once breeding birds start feeling stressed, it can affect everything. Sometimes they stop showing interest in the breeding box. Sometimes they become aggressive. And sometimes, they simply don't feel comfortable enough to settle properly. I also noticed that certain areas of the aviary were much busier than others. And because of that, some birds never really had a calm private space. At first, I thought the birds would eventually get used to it. But over time, I realized the setup itself needed to become calmer and more organized. In my experience, breeding birds do much better when they feel safe, relaxed, and undisturbed. And honestly, this was one of the biggest reasons why I decided to change my setup completely. Another big reason why I changed my setup was the way the breeding boxes were placed. At first, I didn't think box placement mattered that much. I thought, as long as the birds had boxes, everything would work itself out. But after watching the birds carefully, I realized that placement makes a huge difference. Some boxes were too close together, and because of that, certain birds became territorial. Sometimes, one pair would disturb another pair, especially during breeding season. I also noticed that some birds preferred quieter areas, while other boxes were in busier parts of the aviary, and the difference in behavior was very noticeable. The birds in calmer areas often seemed more relaxed, more comfortable, and more confident, while other birds looked nervous or unsettled. In my experience, budgies need enough space between breeding areas, not just for comfort, but also to reduce stress and competition. Another thing I realized was that overcrowding can create hidden problems. Even if the aviary looks big enough, too many birds around breeding boxes can still create tension. And honestly, once I started adjusting the spacing and placement, I noticed a big improvement in the overall atmosphere of the setup. The birds seemed calmer, there was less fighting, and breeding behavior started looking much more natural. That's when I realized, sometimes small setup changes can make a much bigger difference than people expect. Another reason why I changed my breeding setup was because cleaning started becoming much more difficult. At first, I managed it without too many problems. But as time went on, I realized that some parts of the setup were not practical at all. Certain areas became harder to clean properly, especially around the breeding boxes. And when you keep birds, cleanliness becomes very important, not just for appearance, but for the health and comfort of the birds too. I also noticed that when the setup became harder to maintain, it created more stress for me as well. Because instead of enjoying the birds, I was constantly trying to manage the setup. In my experience, a good breeding setup should not only work for the birds, it should also be practical for the person taking care of them. Another issue was that some areas didn't have good airflow, and because of that, dust and mess built up more quickly. Over time, I started understanding that a cleaner, simpler, and more organized setup would be much better for everyone. So when I redesigned things, I also focused on making the setup easier to clean. And honestly, that made a huge difference. The aviary felt fresher, more organized, and much easier to manage day after day. Sometimes people focus only on the birds themselves, but in my experience, the way you maintain the setup is just as important. After I changed my budgie breeding setup, I honestly started noticing a difference quite quickly, not just in the setup itself, but in the birds' behavior too. The whole aviary started feeling calmer. The birds looked more relaxed, there was less stress, and the overall environment felt much more natural. One thing I noticed immediately was that breeding pairs seemed more comfortable in their own spaces. There was less competition around the breeding boxes, and fewer problems between certain birds. In my experience, when birds feel comfortable, you can usually see it. very clearly in their behavior. They become calmer, more confident, and more focused on normal breeding behavior. Another thing I noticed was that the aviary became easier to manage overall. Cleaning felt simpler, the setup looked more organized, and everything felt less stressful day to day. At first, I honestly didn't expect small changes to make such a big difference. But over time, I realized that setup design affects much more than people think. Sometimes, people focus only on food, or breeding boxes, or bird pairs, but the environment itself plays a huge role too. And honestly, changing the setup was probably one of the best decisions I made for my budgies. Not because the old setup was completely bad, but because the new setup simply worked better. And in my experience, you are always learning when you keep birds. Even after a long time, there are always things you can improve. One specific change I made in the setup was changing the position of the breeding boxes. And honestly, this made more difference than I expected. Before, some of the breeding boxes were placed higher and closer to the ceiling. At the time, I thought that was the best position, but after watching the birds, I realized that certain placements were not working as well. So eventually, I decided to move some breeding boxes slightly lower. And I also changed which side of the aviary they were placed on. I actually showed this change in one of my previous videos too. And after making those adjustments, I started noticing that some birds looked much more comfortable. In my experience, even small changes in breeding box position can affect how secure and relaxed the birds feel. Some birds preferred quieter corners, while others seemed more comfortable when the boxes were slightly lower. And honestly, this taught me that setup design is not always about doing what looks best. Sometimes, it's about observing the birds carefully, and adjusting things based on their behavior. That's one of the biggest lessons I've learned from keeping budgies. So overall, changing my budgie breeding setup was not something I decided overnight. It happened slowly, after watching the birds carefully, and noticing small problems over time. In my experience, that's one of the most important things about keeping birds. You learn constantly. Sometimes, you realize that small setup changes can make a very big difference, not only for breeding, but also for the birds' comfort, their behavior, and the overall atmosphere of the aviary. For me personally, the changes I made helped create a calmer and more organized setup. And honestly, I feel the birds became much more comfortable afterwards. Of course, every aviary is different, and every bird keeper has their own way of doing things. But this is what worked for me, and I wanted to share my experience with you. Maybe some of these ideas can also help improve your own setup. And if you keep budgies yourself, you'll probably understand that sometimes the smallest changes can make the biggest difference. Let me know in the comments. Have you ever changed your bird setup before? And what improvements worked best for you? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.